Donald Trump's administration has launched an assault against various educational institutions, not least Columbia University. The claim is that they are not doing enough to protect Jewish students. This actually, of course, relates to the encampments protests over Gaza, the genocide being committed. Of course, there were large numbers of Jewish students who participated in those particular protests. And Columbia University actually viciously clamped down on those protests, including taking drastic action against students, but that hasn't saved them from these attacks. But even more sinister is the deportation or proposed deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, who is a green card holder in the US, who is married to a US citizen who's 8 months pregnant. Now, there's no better person to talk to about what's just going on at the moment, and I guess this assault and how it's being framed by the Trump administration, than the brilliant Lara Friedman, who is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Such an incredible voice throughout the horrors of the last year and a half, pretty much. Obviously before that as well. But someone I look up to. So it's such an honor to be able to speak to you, even though these are dark times. Hi, Lara. How are you doing?
Hi, Owen, and thank you. I'd say the same right back at you. So thank you for your work.
Bless you. Let's just, I mean, in terms of the way this is being framed, so Donald Trump, I guess let's start with the free speech claims that he made. He said at the State of the Union address, free speech is back. I've restored free speech. J.D. Vance, his vice president, is lecturing you upon free speech. Then they issue these various executive orders, including one which is saying that, illegal protests, students who take part in them will be arrested, expelled, deported. And what just in terms of this whole mantra, they're talking about free speech, the defense of it, and look, and then of course withdrawing funding from Columbia and perhaps other education institutions.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, let's be fair. They've really just picked up the ball and run with it where it was left for them, fairly far down the field. I don't know what sports metaphor we're using here, by the Biden administration, right?
Okay.
So if the progressive side of the spectrum is supposed to be generally the standard barriers for free speech, they made clear during the Biden administration, in the wake of the October 7th calamity, and then what came from that with protests, they made clear that not all free speech is free speech, and that they were going to go after protesters, and they were going to really encourage and press. And this was bipartisan, and it was very much led by folks in the Biden administration. Anyone who expected the Trump administration to be less anti-Palestinian or less grabbing onto this agenda than the Biden administration, I think, was probably deluding themselves. But it's always been the case in the US that not all free speech is really free speech. There are disfavored kinds of speech, and anything related to Palestine has always been in that category. But I mean, there's no question for the Republicans, and we saw this during since October 7th on the Hill. They have recognized claims of acting to fight anti-Semitism or acting to ensure the safety of Jews, as they would say it, has been turned into a blunt instrument, a sharp-edged weapon against free speech, against academia, against free thought, against the freedom to protest. And they were doing that to great effect during the previous administration. It's no surprise that the Trump administration has just run with it. I think the only surprise for some people, folks were saying when Trump was elected, he can't do everything everywhere all at once. So we'll have a period to fight things and to prepare ourselves and adjust. And, here we are, and it's, barely into the first quarter of the first year of this administration. And they've really done a lot. And, if people think it's going to get better on its own without, some sort of protest, and, I don't know what can be done, but I mean, this is moving very, very fast.
When you hear the likes of Donald Trump say that this is about the failure of educational institutions to protect Jewish students, and that he's presenting himself as someone who is there as a champion of Jewish Americans from a vicious anti-Semitic onslaught, what do you think when you hear that framing from him?
I mean, I'm enraged as an American, as a Jewish American, as someone who, has been watching and engaging with people on campuses, and, certainly for the past 2 years. I mean, it's absurd. Again, I think it's important to say he is just echoing the same language and framing that was used during the Biden administration by Biden officials. He's echoing the language and framing offered by the Anti-Defamation League. I mean, if we're in a moment where basic freedom of speech and civil rights, the rights of someone who is a legal permanent resident, to not have their green cards stripped away unceremoniously in violation of law. If we're in that moment, the path was paved here by so-called progressives who decided the progressive accept on Palestine could be extended to include essentially decimating civil liberties in this country.
I mean, it's a really important point that, the likes of Kamala Harris during the election said Donald Trump's a fascist. And, if that was the position presented by mainstream Democrats, that this is certainly an authoritarian, I mean, he is an authoritarian demagogue, but I mean, that that was the position they put forward. But I mean, what we're talking about here is how they laid the foundations, paved the way for a even more of an authoritarian crackdown by the man they styled as a fascist.
Yeah, I mean, and it's specifically using Palestine. Let's be clear, and manipulating this idea of Jewish safety. I mean, we saw for the last almost 2 years now. This is a year and a half before Trump came in. This narrative, this drumbeat, including from officials of the Biden administration, including from the ADL and others in the Jewish organizational world, essentially, when you're in a situation where what Israel is doing is on its face indefensible by any normal arguments, right? And here I'm not just talking about there's a media report that Israel did this. I'm talking about the videos that the soldiers were taking of themselves. Okay, we cannot engage in the facts of what the protesters are protesting and win. So we have to shut down the protesters. And we saw this narrative where you had very serious senior Democrats and groups like the ADL accusing the protesters of being in league with terrorists, being paid by terrorists, being engaged with terrorists. I mean, in China, there's one argument. I mean, here we are today. I mean, if Democrats and progressives didn't understand that language would lead to not just violence against protesters on campus, which we saw and which was allowed to pass, but would also lead to a stripping of rights and civil liberties, which would then, and this is why I think you're seeing Democrats and more broadly progressives stand up and say, oh shit, not the ADL is cheering. But if you recognize that this is setting up, it's normalizing the stripping of rights when it comes to disfavored free speech. That's why people are standing up today. It's not because they care about this one student at Columbia or they care about protesters in general. It's because they suddenly realize, and this includes some people on the right, that if you don't protect the fundamental rule of law when it comes to the rights of people you disagree with, it's eventually going to come for you. And the scandal, or the shanda, I'm speaking here as a Jewish American, for those of us who are raised as Jewish Americans, that, rule of law and free speech and defending the most vulnerable in society, this is in some ways the birthright of the Jewish people, of us as Jewish Americans, with the history that Jews have had across the generations, right, as the most vulnerable people. That's why, civil liberties are something that is so treasured, we are told, by the Jewish community. And now we're in this moment where when Donald Trump posts his snarky glib post celebrating that they're going to deport a student for free speech, it says shalom on it. They're literally putting like a Jewish stamp, not just Israeli, Jewish. This is not, the Hebrew language doesn't belong only to Israel. They're putting a Jewish stamp on what is effectively a move towards outright authoritarianism.
I mean, you mentioned the Anti-Defamation League, which purportedly exists to fight anti-Semitism. I mean, Donald Trump, he said that Jewish Americans who support the Democrats, the vast majority, hate their religion, hate everything about Israel, should be ashamed of themselves, that they would have a lot of blame if he lost the election. And Elon Musk did, Nazi salutes and also expressed his agreement with the tweet claiming Jewish communities were pushing hatred against whites. The ADL did not bend over backwards to not condemn the Nazi salute, but they're swinging behind the people I've just noted as champions of Jewish people, including deporting someone with a green card of Palestinian origin who's married to an American woman.
Yeah. Look, we had Steve Bannon recently talking about, this is at CPAC, where he basically, he more or less said that the 80% of Jewish Americans who didn't vote for Trump are enemies under the wire when it comes to Israel. And, this follows up on, and I was tracking this in a thread on X. I mean, for the past year and a half, we've seen an escalation of language, which went from it's anti-Israel to it's anti-Semitic to it's pro-terror to it's anti-American. So we are having almost, I started using the term McCarthyism and Red Scare a year ago. I mean, if you're going to start framing criticism of Israel and protest of Israel as anti-American, the line between that and deportations, I said this at the time, is very, very thin. And we had deportations and executions back at that time. I mean, this is serious stuff. And it's aimed not just at Palestinian Americans, but obviously, first and foremost, it's at Palestinians who are here and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. But if you understand the nature of attacks on civil liberties, this is aimed at everybody, everyone who's in any way in a disfavored ideological place.
I mean, just a couple of final things. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil, who I mentioned there, we've mentioned, sorry, repeatedly there. I mean, how serious do you think that actually is in terms of what precedent is being set? Because, you know, he's a green card holder, and they've accused basically of Hamas adjacent activities or something along those lines, which is obviously extremely fluid, all-encompassing terms. We've seen how anti-Israel hate, as they call it, is used as an all-encompassing term, which is conflated with anti-Semitism. I mean, what do you think? How scary is that precedent if we're talking about a slide towards authoritarianism more generally?
Well, I mean, they're not talking about Hamas adjacent. They're using the term Hamas aligned, activities that align with Hamas, which is a fascinating term that doesn't exist anywhere in law. There's U.S. law against material support for terrorist organizations. As of now, he has not been in any way accused of or indicted for or tried for or had his day in. You know, this is the whole, we do have rule of law for material support for terror. If there's a case, they should make it, they should build it, he should be able to defend himself. That isn't what's happening. This is very much a sort of, you know, fuzzy new category, which says when it comes to people who are in this category of anti-Israel, anti-American, they don't need due process. The laws don't apply. And that seems to be really what was being tested here, is whether or not, because this isn't this, you know, the question of whether or not they can strip a student visa is much clearer. They can. Student visas are much, you're in a much more tenuous position. But a green card holder, a legally permanent resident, has legal rights. This isn't just according to me. I'm not a lawyer. This is according to lawyers, and including Republican lawyers who are looking at this saying, whoa, this is not right. You have this weird moment where you have conservative Republicans coming out to the left of the Anti-Defamation League on this. The precedent they seem to be setting is whether or not they can get away with that. You know, the fact that they moved him very quickly from New York, which has the ability to deal with someone in detention, and they moved him to Louisiana, to a place which is generally a jumping off point for throwing people out of the country, suggests they were trying to get him out before anybody could challenge it. I guess the question now is, you know, you have a judge in New York. My understanding is he's actually an Orthodox Jewish judge, in case people want to view this as somehow anti-Semitic judge, who has ruled that he has to be brought in to appear in court in New York. I guess the question is whether or not they'll even do that. I mean, will they abide by the ruling of a court, or will they just deport him? And if they do, I mean, to some extent, this administration seems to be flirting with the question of how far can we go with, you know, Trump saying, if I say it, it's the law. I'm president. L'état c'est moi, right? And nothing I do is illegal. You know, it's a very it's a very scary situation we're in, and the fact that it's being tested first in the first instance with a Palestine-related issue should not surprise people. This is the issue. You bring up Palestine, you bring up claims of anti-Semitism, and much like we saw during the entire Biden administration, the hope is that you get the Democrats and Republicans to line up in support, and if they won't line up in support, you call them anti-Semites.
And just finally on that, I mean, you know, anti-Semitism is extremely real evil. It's very present. I mean, what are your concerns about the way that term is being used, and I guess stripped of its actual meaning? And also, what do you think about the claims that these protests are a threat to your security as a Jewish American, that you should be scared and fearful because of the activities of the Palestinian solidarity movement?
Look, as a Jewish American, I mean, the last decade has seen a rise of a kind of very public anti-Semitism, which was always there under the surface, I guess, and it's very worrying, and it's led to attacks on synagogues. It's led to all sorts of you know, this is very real, and it's well documented. The fact that the energies of many of the organizations in the community that should be fighting this have been shifted away from actual anti-Semitism. Actual anti-Semitism meaning, very simply for most of us, threats, attacks, targeting, discrimination against Jews because they're Jewish. That has been essentially shunted to the side. We're not worried about that. What we're worried about is anti-Semitism, by which we mean criticism of Israel, protest of Israel, anything that makes people who are supportive of Israel uncomfortable. And I mean, you just let the other one metastasize. We're living, you said, we're living in a moment where we have, people who are supportive of Israel doing Nazi salutes publicly, and it's not even a scandal. And anyone who suggests it's a scandal is attacked for not focusing on the real problem, which is criticism of Israel. I think that itself is a danger to the Jewish people. For me as a Jew, that feels like it is endangering me. I don't feel like protests of Israel endanger me. I do recognize that there are people who are anti-Semitic in every group, in everywhere around the world. And I recognize that protesters, whether it's civil disobedience or even crossing moral lines, are going to be held accountable. And that's the truth in every protest on any issue. That's not the same as saying that the mere act of speaking against Israel's policies or against Zionism is anti-Semitism and must be punished. And the fact is, there is a large Jewish contingent among those protesters. They are being invisibilized for the sake of this simplistic framing, which says it's all anti-Semitism. And increasingly we're to the point where the entire Jewish community that is supportive of genocide in Gaza is invisibilized. And that is a danger to the safety of all of us as Jews as well.
Wonderfully put. The world turned upside down, as I keep saying throughout this. It really is a case of, I think, in this horror of the world repeatedly being turned on its head, but really eloquently put, full of moral integrity and clarity. Really brilliant stuff. For those watching and listening, do share this video, press like, subscribe, leave comments, good for the algorithm, so more people listen to Lara, which is obviously the point. But Lara, honestly, what an honor. Thank you so much for you in your brilliant work and your voice.
Thank you for having me on.